to DFA of NYU third speaker series, when we get to know from different experts in human-centered design and social innovation. Today we have the pleasure to host Zenjief Del Castillo, who is a user experience researcher, TVC contractor at Google. Zen will share with us his journey from his bachelor's degree, his master's, and then his job. I had the pleasure to meet Zen while I was doing an internship there at Google this summer. So for no further introduction, I will pass it to Zen. Thank you so much for being here with us. We are so happy to have you and can wait to see all you have to share with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Let me just present.
We got it.
Perfect. Thanks, Gabby. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Zen. My pronouns are he, him, his. Next slide, please. So I'm currently you're moving way too fast. So yeah, I'm currently a user experience or UX researcher here at Google. I've been a researcher for about 3+ years now. Today I'm just gonna walk through like my journey through research, and then I'll talk more about like what it is that I do as a user researcher, and also offer some advice for those who want to get into UX. So it all started when I was actually in college. I went to this university in California at Davis, which is a very small town in Northern California. It's pretty much like a college town filled with cows. I did my bachelor's in sociology and psychology. And throughout my experiences in college, I was doing a lot of research in various social sciences. So I was a research assistant for a sociology professor and also a professor in the graduate school of management. So a lot of the work that I did were around like social sciences. I did research on police shootings and also like the e-cigarette industry. So lots of more quantitative heavy research. And on top of doing this type of work, I was also interning at various resource centers on campus. So I volunteered at the LGBT center on campus, and I also interned at this resource centers that provided resources for underrepresented communities. So I was doing a lot of more, I guess, community organizing work. And because of this, next slide, please. So yeah, because of this, I decided to pursue a career in law. I figured that since this is something that I was super passionate about, I wanted to make this into a career. So I geared up myself to be pre-law from then on out, and then I even decided to apply for like the LSAT to take it, and then I was ready to apply for law school. I had like a list and everything, and I think like when I was like a second year or third year, I was like ready to pursue this field and to be a lawyer, or specifically like a human rights or a civil rights lawyer. And before doing that, though, I realized I don't know much about like the day-to-days of what it is that lawyers do. So let me intern somewhere. So I interned at a law firm in the Bay Area. And next slide. And essentially, I hated my experience there. So a lot of the lawyers that I interacted with were very, very rude and condescending. So there was one time where I was drafting like, I think it was like a cover letter or something like that, and I misspelled something, and then the lawyer like literally called me stupid for having like one typo. And then ever since then I was like, maybe the career in law is not the best way of going about this. Maybe I can do something else with my life instead of being be feeling condescending or have my colleagues be condescending towards me. So I really didn't really know what to do from here on out. So next slide. So I panicked, and at this point, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer, but then now that plan was like out of the way. So I kind of just panicked and didn't really know what to do. I was going through college, just taking classes as normal and like trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to do. On the side, I still was doing research because this was actually something that I really loved doing throughout college. I enjoyed meeting with my professors and actually really thinking about like the problems and what methods we can use to solve a problem, how to analyze the data set that we have. And at this point, though, I didn't really see myself myself pursuing a career in research because I thought to be a researcher you need a PhD, and who has the time or money to be to pursue a PhD? Like I certainly didn't have time. I had loans, still do, so I didn't want to go into that route. So I kind of just like did it as a hobby. So next slide. So I graduated college, and I was very, very lucky and very fortunate to have landed like a very short contracting job at Google as a user experience researcher assistant, working on the Google Home products. So these were some of the things that I actually worked on during my time there. And when I was working in my team, I realized that, oh, I can actually pursue a career in research, and it's something that I can pursue without having a PhD. It was also during that time when I found out about the field of human factors and ergonomics, which, if y'all don't know, it's basically like an interdisciplinary field that applies psychological and physiological principles to basically product design. And the overall goal is to reduce human error and ensure safety and comfort when we're interacting with products. So I met someone who went to a program at San Jose State University here in the Bay Area, and they told me all about like what it is human factors researchers do, or UX researchers, and how that type of information or knowledge would be beneficial for a career in research. So since then, I actually decided to go to grad school and work full time. Next slide, please. So because of like my fascination of human computer interaction and human factors and user experience research, I decided to continue doing this line of work while also pursuing grad school at the time. So when after my contract at Google ended, I got a job as a research analyst at a market/user research firm. So I was doing a lot of like quantitative, like survey methodology research, trying to understand how different companies and their competitors are, how users are seeing their brands. There was a project that I worked on about like what is called like ages 4 to 12 years old and how they interact with virtual assistants. So I was doing that kind of like more quantitative work. And then I ended up getting like a full-time internship at SAP, working on like a bunch of enterprise products. And then I landed my job here at Google. I actually met Gabriella at Google working in the Google Docs team. So we worked on this project together. That was super fun. And it was my first time working with her. So that's where I am now, and I'm still doing that. But before that, I was actually in another team at Google, working on keeping Google accounts secure. So y'all know how when you sign into your Google account from like another device and you get an email screaming at you saying, oh, who is this trying to sign in? That's pretty much the team that I worked on. And yeah, this is where I am now. But some of y'all are probably wondering, like, what is user experience research? Can you go to the next slide, please? But so essentially, user research or user experience research is a part of the product development process. So at Google, it's housed within like the design team. So I work really closely with designers. And essentially, this is a systematic study of identifying user needs, goals, pain points, and mental models. So essentially, I talk to people and I try to translate what I find and into the product to see like what if we're building right, if we're building the right solutions that are meeting users' needs and reducing any pain points that they may have. Next slide. As user researchers, we're part of the product team that typically consists of designers, product managers, and software engineers. So I collaborate closely with my cross-functional partners in order to make sure that we're creating products that are delightful and also intuitive, and making sure that they're user-friendly. So when I worked with Gabriella, she was actually my product manager. And then we also worked with a designer and also like a lot of engineers in our team. So on a typical day, there's probably like closer to like 10 plus people that you interact with on just one project alone. Next slide. And this one, this transition. So, so as a user researcher, I conduct different types of research essentially. So the first type that I do is a qualitative research, where I essentially just interview a bunch of people and talk to them about their user needs, pain points, and things like that. The second one is quantitative research, where I'm actually doing this right now, and I don't know. A lot of the analysis that I'm doing are very, very complicated, and I'm working with a lot of like large scale survey data to answer my team's questions. So it's a lot of, t-testing, ANOVA, regression, if you're aware of that. That's essentially like what I'm doing right now. My day-to-day varies a lot. Sometimes I'm in meetings all day with my stakeholders to align on product roadmaps. Sometimes I'm planning research and collecting data. So a lot of the times, before COVID, I was in labs doing usability tests or interviews, but now they're more remote. So that's still something that I do. And then other times, like this week, for instance, I'm heads down analyzing data and creating research reports to present to my stakeholders within that week or the following week. So every day is essentially a different task. There's not a lot. I wouldn't say there's a week where you're doing the same things over and over again. It's always changing as you go through like your product and like where you are in the research cycle and things like that. Next slide. So ultimately, the work that I do brings the voice of the user into the product development process so that we're designing and creating products with the user in mind. So my work is very critical so that we're preventing users from having experiences like this, from like what you can see. So I test different products so that we make sure that they don't encounter any issues like this from going out into the public. Next slide. So I know the field of UX, specifically research or UX research, is a hot and growing field, and getting into it is actually getting more and more difficult, especially in this pandemic. Even highly experienced professionals are struggling to get a job in this field right now. So here's just some advice that like I've been giving throughout the years, and also that I want to pass on to those who want to pursue a career in UX research. Next slide. So the first advice that like everyone has told me since when I was like starting out in this is to really know your UX research methods from in and out. So knowing your qualitative and quantitative methods and when to apply them in like the product development cycle is very, very important. As user researchers, you're expected to know the pros and cons of these methods and when you would apply them. And having this strong foundation really sets you up to have a career in research. Next slide. Some of y'all might not even have like any research experience, and that's totally fine. But something that I was also given back then was to continue building your portfolio by volunteering in for different projects. So getting involved in research is difficult, and you need to be able to show that you have some relevant work experience or relevant work samples when you're in this like interview process. So one thing that I always tell people or someone who's trying to get into this field is to try to volunteer your time and try to find nonprofits that would benefit a lot from research. There's plenty of organizations out there who have a website that has very bad UX, and that they would really benefit from like a basic usability test to improve that website. So that's something that can help you build your portfolio, and you can show that your work has a clear impact. Next slide. And another advice that I was given is that you think about your transferable skills. And this is something that like not only did I learn from my years of experience, but also something I heard from a UX research leader at LinkedIn. She compared her previous experiences as kind of like Voltron, like the robot, because like she come from like sales to customer engagement and even like a waiter. And essentially what she said is that the culmination of your experiences kind of add up to you becoming a good researcher. So just because you're applying for a researcher job doesn't mean that your experiences as a non-researcher aren't relevant. So there's no single pathway into being a researcher, and we all have certain skills from our past experiences that make us good researchers. So if you can recall earlier, I talked about being involved in like community organizing spaces and advocating for underrepresented communities. But if you think about it, that's the kind of work that I do on a day-to-day. You know, I'm constantly advocating for the user to my product team and trying to organize and align my team so that we're being user-centric in developing these products. So think about the skills that you have, and think about all the skills that you have that may be applicable to being a researcher, and highlight them in your resume or your interviews and things like that. And lastly, this is something that I'm always still trying to like remind myself, is to know your worth and be kind to yourself. I think this is important, especially as we all embark in this career journey, that it's going to be hard to get into this field, and you're probably going to experience a lot of like discouragements as you move along. And imposter syndrome is a thing that I still go through every day. But I think it's important to think about that you have a lot of experiences, you have a lot of knowledge. So I think just take it easy and realize that you're not alone in this. But yeah, those are all the questions or the things I have for you. Next slide. I think the next one is just like, if you have any questions, I can answer them. I know I went through that super quick, but yeah.
Thanks very much, Zen. Gabriela, do you want to kick us off with a question while I'm looking at the questions coming in on the chat? Please feel free to share your questions on the chat, or even to just unmute yourself and you can talk.
Exactly.
We have a few questions. So Gabriela, do you have a question, or do you want to start reading from the chat?
I have just one quick, I don't know if a question or a comment, but I just wanted to highlight how important it is for our DFA members right now, because they are conducting some research on their own. And I've seen some of Sen's interviews, and they were really good, because users were going away we didn't want them to go, and he kind of like took them out of there and put them in the right place, or like showed them the right direction. So I think that any advice that you have on how to conduct interviews in particular, Sen, I think that would be very beneficial for our DFA members. So if there's any like highlight tip or anything that you think they should know, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, specifically interviews, right? So when we were doing our project together, I was really thinking about like what the goals were, and like what were the questions that you wanted me to be answered in the research. So really knowing that as the foundation of your research, and going into it knowing that you're answering a set of questions, is very important. So from the scenario that Gabriela mentioned, a lot of the users were talking about something completely different. So I think that's when you're how you differentiate between signal and noise can really like come into play. So like with our work, I was really trying to stray away from going into a different route when I know that the questions are not gonna, or the questions that we're trying to answer is not really gonna go that way. So I think knowing your research questions like from like top to bottom, you know, at the back of your hand, is very important.
Right. So I'm going to read from the chat.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe we can take turns with Gabriela, so we have the French and Argentinian accent sharing. So first, some had a question about the imposter syndrome. It's so real. Do you have a support group you go to find support and companionship?
Yeah, I actually do. So some of them are actually in this call today. So I have like from my cohort from my grad program, like some of them are also working at Google as user research assistants or user researchers. And we're always just talking to each other about like how we're feeling, and talking about like what we can do to combat these feelings. So I think having your close friends, even if they're not working with you directly, are very beneficial. And another thing that I've also seen is that there's a lot of like design research, user research mailing lists out there. There's a Google group that constantly, you know, talks about these things. And I think it's important to like also read up on what other people are saying in those resources.
Thank you, San.
Yeah.
Now we have a question from Wesley. My question is, for your educational journey, what made you realize that you were ready to go to grad school?
I think knowing what field I wanted to get into, and also knowing and looking at people on LinkedIn and seeing their educational backgrounds and seeing that majority of them have a master's in some, educational area, really made me realize that I need to get a master's in order for me to get a job in this field. And some people don't get a master's and still break into the field of user research, but I think it just helps me. Like I was able to get an internship because of my master's program or being enrolled in a master's program. So I think it really elevates your credibility as well.
Right. The next question is, any tips on, by Jordan, any tips on how to make your portfolio stand out, and what was the interview process like at Google for your position?
Yeah, so those two different questions. Tips on how to make your portfolio stand out. I think highlighting impact is very, very important, not just in your portfolio, but in your resume or in your interviews, highlighting like the work that you did and also what came out of your research is very important. So a lot of tech companies look at like what can you bring into our, into our products, like whether that's interviews or like usability tests. You need to be able to highlight that like something came out of your research findings and the team took your findings and went somewhere with it. And then the next question was the interview process like at Google. So there's a difference between being a full-timer at Google and also being a contractor at Google. I do the same work as a full-timer would do. I think the primary difference is that I'm not technically employed by Google. I'm technically employed by a third-party agency, but the interview process are kind of similar. I think obviously for a full-timer, it's just more rigorous and like it's a lot. And Gabriella, you can probably speak to this since you actually went through it. But as a contractor, it's similar process where you get asked like hypothetical questions about like, they would give you like hypothetical question about how would you conduct research if, let's say, I don't know, your product manager wants to increase user engagement in your product, so something like that, and you need to figure out like how can you do research on that and like what methods you would do, why would you use XYZ methods, and how would you analyze data, and what would the impact of that research be. That's the primary interview process I've come across, and also there's the portfolio presentation and talking about your impact and things like that. So it really varies.
Thank you, Sam. Now we have a question from Akshit. How much of your job requires coding and how much of it is research?
My job specifically, I'm a mixed methods researcher leaning more towards qualitative research. So I don't do any coding, but quantitative researchers they do some coding. Like I know quant researchers who use R or like Python, things like that. I'm not that person, so I don't do any coding. And how much of it is research? I would say actually like 50% of it is research, 50% is stakeholder management. A lot of the times, much of the work that you do is really talking to your teams and like advocating for the user, evangelizing your research findings and making sure that people are acting on those findings. So yeah.
Thank you. There's another question from Wesley. During your undergrad, you were really involved more in qualitative research. How did you start transitioning into quantitative research, and where did you start learning quant methods?
Yeah, so actually it was the other way around. I was doing more quantitative research in college and then got into more qualitative. And I think that's just primarily like the company and like the team that I was in. So we were primarily when I was in my when I was a research analyst at the quant firm, I was doing a lot of surveys. But then when I went to SAP, working on enterprise products, a lot of the need were qualitative methods, and that's where I really honed in on like the interviews and usability testing, concept evals, and yeah. So I think it's just a matter of where the company took me.
Thank you, Sam. Now we have a question from Jordan. As Sam said earlier, the UX industry is already quite saturated. So are there any similar up and coming career paths that we can also look into pursuing?
That's a good question. There's besides, user research is also market researchers, which I was kind of a market researcher before, like I evidently became like a user researcher. And that's the work that you're doing are still grounded on the same, qualitative and quantitative research methods. So that's one avenue. Another avenue is maybe like consumer insights researcher. They also do similar things. It's not technically called user research, but you could do the same type of interviewing and research skills.
Great, thank you. Patrick, I think maybe you had a question, or?
Oh yeah, I do have a question. I actually just typed into the chat.
Okay, well, you can read it instead of having me reading it.
I'll just read my own chat. So earlier you mentioned how 50% of your job is research, and then the other 50% is kind of like stakeholder management. Have you ever encountered, and if so, if you could name like an example, any situations where like your research insights or your research reports were not taken into consideration into the products, or were like met with like critiques or backlash from those stakeholders?
Yeah, this sounds like an interview question. This is actually a question that they would ask you in an interview, by the way. So this is a good question. And yeah, I think every researcher has encountered some form of, pushback from their stakeholders, being challenged about like the work that they do, or like the findings and things like that. And I think what I found is being empathetic towards your stakeholders is a good first step into really combating like that situation. So understanding where they're coming from. Do they have knowledge of user research? Do they have knowledge of UX in the first place? And educating them on like where the gaps are. And another tactic that I'm still slowly learning is to really, what is the word? Stand your ground and push back when they push back, because you're the research expert. They should be able to trust you to know like what's good research and not. And like every research has, there's going to be pros and cons to it. There's going to be limitations and there's going to be good, goods to it. And you can always poke a hole in any research project. But I think at the time, or like the constraints that you have, saying that this is the best that we can do at the moment is also important to highlight. And yeah, I don't know if I can give a very specific example, because much of the work that I do have been under NDA. So
okay, that brings a good point I wanted to ask. So similarly, I feel like a lot of work I've done has been under NDA. How do you talk about your work with other people?
Yeah, that's a question that I always get. And I think the one thing that I try to do is to be very, very high level. So you don't have to name the specific product or, the findings that you found, but you can talk about like, what methods did you do? Why did you do that method? What were your constraints that influence your planning of that research? And if you want to talk about findings, you can talk about it super, super high level. So like in some of my presentations or like interviews, I always say something like, users failed to do this, like the main task. And that's usually enough for them to realize like, okay, I see where it's going. This is the impact that it's creating. But yeah, try to be high level, but also highlight like what happened with your research.
I don't know. I don't want to take anybody's time, but like I had a question. I think it's kind of connected to the stakeholder managers. I mean, I think you showed how you're kind of working in very multidisciplinary environments, and so I'm curious, like, how do you see yourself as a translator? Clearly, you're a translator of the user's needs to the design team or even the engineers. How do you work in terms of like collaboration? Any issues? I'm sure you learned things as you were working on different projects. So I think it's like as everyone, even if you're not a UX design researcher, is getting more and more involved in this kind of multidisciplinary collaboration. Any tips on like how do you learn that? Because I think you learn in school to be in one discipline and then slowly move out. So anything that you could share with us would be great.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this question well, but I think collaboration is very important. And the way that I see collaboration in the research realm is really looping your stakeholders in at every step of the way. So when I worked with Gabriella on our project, I made sure that she was involved in the planning stages, and also when I'm running the sessions, and also doing debriefs with her after each session and after each data collection phase, and then also involving her in like the analysis process and the readout, so that whenever I'm doing something within that process, she knows what's going on, and she can already take it to the whoever she needs to go to move on with the project. So I think constant collaboration and looping them on as early as possible is very important in making it very successful. And another thing that I also am growing into is building relationships. So a lot of the times some researchers feel like they do work in silos, but I feel like research is best done when there's multiple people doing it. So I think building relationships with your stakeholders, getting to know them on a personal level, and seeing like what they can do, like maybe looking at the data together, or like talking about like the questions that they want asked, and like what methods that you think could be best, and how they see that really answering the questions would be important as well.
I really like this last point about the kind of building relationship. And so I'm curious, like, first of all, do you have, like, for example, I know that in some design consultancies, when they have design research, they'll have like multiple people involved, and also not only the research team, but like people who might be involved more in the design part or the development of a product. And so I'm curious, like in your role as a UX researcher, like first of all, are you several of, are they several Zen, or is it like just you? And then a second is like how much, so it's great that you're working with the stakeholders, but like, do you feel like that you're really working with, well, I guess you said with Gabriella, you're making sure that she knows, but like how much, is the task predefined, or that, you might end up having the project manager, participating to part of the research. And I guess if you want people to really get your points in terms of research insights, the more you involve them, the more chance you have to have them, trust your data.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to wrap my head around the question. There's a lot. I guess like, what is the first question?
Well,
so I can like answer
really,
that.
Is there only one researcher on the team, or is it multiple people? And then, how much, in this building relationship, how involved other people are on the team in the research process?
Yeah, so it really depends on where you are in where the research and UX community, I guess, is matured in the company. So at work specifically, I am part of a centralized research team, and each researcher is part of a product area. So technically, I'm in a group of researchers that work a lot on the G Suite apps, and then me and another researcher are the Google Docs researcher. So you get really paired with a specific product area. And having two researchers in one product area is typically very rare. Sometimes only one researcher is in that product area. So in my old team, I was the only researcher in my product area for security methods in your Google account. And that really depends on like how big the space is and the type of research that's really needed there. And in terms of who gets included throughout the process, it's typically the entire product team, so designer, engineers, and also the PM or product manager. But other teams also loop in maybe marketing or program managers or project managers. So it really depends on like who really cares about that the data.
To add on Sam's point, I can mention that I was also surprised that at Google they pay a lot of attention to research, because they build products to users, and users are the most important part of products. So even like, for example, if Sen would do some type of research, he would come up with different slides and presentations, and that information is available for anyone that wants to see it. You go and create like a short, quick link that say something about the research, and that information is available for anyone. Of course, it depends on the level of confidentiality that the project or product has, but in general, the information is available, and different teams, because different teams are involved on that, or maybe the research touches different points of different products. So in general, the information is widely available from my experience.
Yeah, we have a research archive at work, and anyone can go on it and see any type of research you want to look into. So it's not just related to our team, but like the entire Google ecosystem.
So I guess it raises a question about documentation. And for those of who have been in my class, I keep saying that you need to document your research, and for DFA teams too. So, and I guess that particularly if it becomes archived, you know, for everyone to see. So what's your process? How do you, you know, like document your process? I don't know, any tips on that? Because I'm sure that for all of the people who've been in my class or who work at DFA, they've heard me say it like more than once that they need to document.
Yeah, so I typically start the research process with a research plan that includes like all the research questions, what questions you're going to ask in the study, and also link different documents on there, like what is it called, like product requirement documents, or design mocks, or even like past research. So my research plan is technically like the Bible of, you know, the research. I also include like the research report there after I'm done with it. That's typically just so like whenever someone's gonna go into this again, they can see like how the research was set up if they have any questions. And then I also kind of link all those things again in the report. So there's multiple places you can find multiple things, just so you don't, you know, only look at it in one area.
And talking about the research plan, I just wanted to mention that when Sen talked about involving different stakeholders, he shared his research plan with product managers, designers, and engineers, and all of us could like see. And if any one of us like needed to know something specifically about the user, we could comment or say, hey, Sen, we want to learn this about the user. So like the research plan was really the starting point for all of us and for all the team involved in the product.
Yeah, it's very, I see the research plan as very collaborative. So anyone is free to comment and, you know, disagree, agree on like what I'm talking about. But as long as we're all getting on the same page, I think is what's important.
Right. I mean, I had there's a question. I'm just trying to. No. I was wondering, you know, you talked a lot about like the community engagement project that you did, you know, during your school years. And I think that like DFA is a lot about like projects. So I'm curious, like, you know, what role, I mean, it seemed from your presentation that it was like really key in getting you to first realize that you like doing research, while also make you think that you wanted to be a lawyer, but like you figured out that it was not what you wanted. But like, yeah. So I'm curious, like, you know, any things about like the importance of these projects, maybe how, you know, you talked about portfolio, and I think oftentimes, you know, it can be scary to think about what do you put in your portfolio, you know, if you don't have, like, as you said, that many internships. So what's the role of all these volunteering projects there? Yeah, I think that would be already useful.
Okay, yeah. And I think my past experiences in those like fields and like those spaces really helped me be empathetic, and empathy is at the heart of what we do as user researchers or anyone in the UX field. You need to be able to put yourself in your shoes so you can advocate for what your users are saying to your product team. So I think working in those spaces and interacting with different populations, and specifically underrepresented communities, maybe be more empathetic and kind of helped me get to the point of like how I can advocate for these people at work. So I think that's more of like the soft skills. I can't really say that like the work that I did there I can add on to my portfolio, you know, but I think highlighting that in your interviews or something can really help you.
Any other question?
I just wanted to ask you, Sen, how do you
Yeah.
come up with a research plan? What are the pieces of information you need? And because I feel that that's the starting point, so you have to really get it right. So yes, what do you need to do to start the research plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I said earlier that the research plan is typically is kind of like this Bible of research, but a research plan is also evolving. It's not, just one standalone thing. It's a living document. So I think what's important in the research plan is to understand like what the problem is. So what is the background of the project or the background or the product? What questions or goals are you trying to achieve from the research itself? What methods are you going to use to answer those questions? What potential impact can you have with those using those methods? And then if you want, you can also include like the specific questions that you want to add in your research, but you don't have to. But typically, those are the biggest things that should be in the research plan.
Thank you, Sen. We have a question from Christina. Has anything changed about your process since everything going completely remote? User interviews, collaborating with coworkers, stakeholders, etc. If so, how? Positive or negative changes?
Yeah, in terms of like the day-to-day research, I don't think much has changed. Much of the work that I was doing before COVID has been like remote research anyway. So like remote interviews or remote usability testing and things like that. So it didn't really change that much. I think what really changed was me talking to my stakeholders and really building that relationship with people, because you can't just tap someone on the back and ask them questions about what the hell this product is. Where now you have to ping them on like Google Hangouts, or you need to set up a meeting with them, and everyone has respects their time or protects their time and blocks off work hours just so you don't set up a meeting with them. So kind of becomes very hard to build that relationship now, and I think it's still a struggle but we're all kind of just adapting to it.
I was wondering, like, it's interesting that you were doing already everything remote, because I think that like sometimes people feel like, oh, now that we're remote, it's going to be harder to do research. So I'm curious, like, for example, for the user testing, like, do you just get people on Google Hangout and share a screen and get them through a scenario, or like giving more like, I guess like a process, no specific of any product, but just a process.
Yeah, it really depends on the thing that you're trying to test and also the product. So before I actually joined the Google Docs team, I was working on a mobile version of something, and we needed to have it kind of in person. Well, it was would be better if it was in person. So that one was kind of difficult doing remotely, because there was a lot of switching back and forth that needed to happen. But yeah, it would really depend on like the product that you're testing, and or like what is it, like a prototype or like just a standalone like UI. But yeah, not sure. Sometimes sometimes I use Google Hangouts, or like that's the primary method that I've been using lately. But there's also other tools out there like usertesting.com or like Validately that can help you get those usability testing type of research.
I think it also depends, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sen, about the prototype. So if it's like a very well-established prototype, because the research can also be done in the very early stages of the product. So that's when you don't have very sophisticated prototypes, and maybe you can do research over Hangouts easier. But maybe if the prototype is more evolved and you need to test more like the product and not the idea, that's when you maybe need more in-person testing, right?
Yeah, it's also dependent on like what it is that you want to find out. If you're trying to find out more about the interaction with the prototype, then definitely that requires the user to actually interact with the prototype. Versus if I'm just trying to ask you if this is valuable to you, then that's something that you can just do, on a Google Hangout. But yeah, it's really dependent on like the research goals and also like the time that the designer can put into the prototype itself. So there's a lot of like different factors at play.
So on that part on the designer role, so I think that what is interesting is also, but what you're showing is how research in fact is there during the whole process. It's not just at the beginning, but so you there as a starting point by even developing the research plan and then conducting interviews or maybe crunching data to get like insights, but then you keep being part of the project up until close to the end with like iteration on the prototypes.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really depends on
the kind of project.
Yeah, so sometimes the team has already something built and you're kind of brought into later stages where there's already a product and you kind of just need to test it, or there wasn't much foundational research done, so you have to kind of do a retrospective type of research and do that foundational work while there's already an existing product. So it's kind of really dependent on when you're brought into the project.
I have a question in terms of, you previously answered some questions in regards to like role/team distribution across like different products, etc. I was wondering how, I guess, if it's equal or not equal, like how equal of an influence do UX researchers have on road mapping?
Ideally, they would have an equal, point of view in the product roadmap. But I think they what am I trying to say? Product development is typically seen as like a stool, where a three-legged stool. So one is product managers or product, and then engineers, and then UX. But typically, one of those two legs or both or two legs are larger than the other. So typically UX is seen as kind of like really important, but typically it really depends on how the team values UX. So a lot of the times they see UX as only design work and not so much research. Research would be nice, but people see research sometimes as blocking, the process, and it's taking too long and things like that. So really depends on how the team is structured. I'm lucky enough to be in a team that really values research and actually puts it into the roadmap and actually takes into account like the time it takes to do research. But in my old team, we definitely did not have that kind of thing, and people were always pushing back and saying research is going to take a long time to do, so we don't need it right now. So it really depends.
Thank you, Sen. We have a last question from Shimon. Okay, wait, sorry. So what are the ways the UX research process differ in a big company like Google versus a small startup? Not sure if you've worked at a startup before, but I know product market fit is quite important to a startup, and I'm curious how they might go about it.
Yeah. So I've actually like interviewed at other startups too. I think the biggest thing is definitely resources. Google is a large company that has tremendous amounts of resources. So I don't have to worry so much about, paying for participants or scheduling participants and things like that, because these companies they have teams that do that. Whereas in a startup, you have to do everything by yourself. You have to recruit participants, find out, how you can pay for them, get the budget for it. And Google is like a good company to grow into to start into as a researcher, because you already have those processes in place. Whereas if you work in a startup, you might have to create those processes for yourself, and also get the team to buy into research. So yeah, that's, I think, the biggest differences.
Thank you, Sen. Does anyone else have any last question you want us to ask Sen? If not, I think we can end it. So thank you so much, Sen. It's been a pleasure to have you. We learned a lot about research, and we hope that our DFA members can apply some of the things we've been talking about. Before closing, I want to share with you the next speaker series we have coming up, Meditation for Empathy with Anne. I will leave the link in the chat. And again, thank you so much, Sen. And we will post the video on YouTube, so the recording will be available for all of you on the DFA channel, and we will email it to the people that sign up on Eventbrite. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a great evening, and see you in the next speaker series.
Thank you, Zen, for your
Thanks,
time.
everyone. Had fun. Bye.
Thank you.